Welcome to Good Reads. I'm your host, Jim Hall. And with me today is Bruce Kopytek. He is the author of Hudson's, Detroit's world-famous department store, an absolutely amazing book that you're going to want to rush out and order after today's interview. Bruce, thank you so much for being on the show today. What an absolutely amazing book. And I want to just jump right in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Let the people at home get to know a little bit about you.
Well, I was born and raised right here in the area. I was actually born, I tell people it's kind of a funny story, born in Hamtramck City Hall. And actually at the time it was a hospital, but it's the City Hall now. So that was way back 64 years ago, almost 65 now, in 1958. I went to local schools. Even for my training as an architect, I was trained at the University of Detroit. So I'm really been here for all of my life. And I've had a career in architecture, but with the various recessions that have happened here and there where I found myself out of work, I've written books. And it's a very, very enjoyable thing for me to start writing and take it to the end and actually see the finished product and then see the reaction from people if it's very positive. So that's what I'm about.
So let's talk about why the subject matter. You and I have talked off camera. I know you're very passionate about this. Why Hudson's? Why is that the focus of this book?
Okay, this relates to your other question that I'm a lifelong resident here. So I myself experienced the J.L. Hudson Company from the time I was a little kid. And it was such an icon in Detroit. It was the center of everything, really. And delving into it a little bit, you know that there was a family that ran it, and they were important people. They did important things for the city. The city grew in a certain way, often because of that retail core at the center and where Hudson's was. So it's such an integral part of anybody's life if they grew up and lived in this area. There's a history before me that's fascinating, and then there's the history after, until it really met its demise. And my experience with this whole thing has just been that people miss it. They really enjoyed it. They love their memories of going to Hudson's and shopping. And I felt right now with the fact that there's a new building being on the site, unfortunately the structure we're familiar with was torn down in 1998, but people have this nostalgia. And I would like for the older people like myself that remember Hudson's to have something that ignites their memory a little bit, sets a fire on them so they can have those nostalgic feelings about Hudson's and about Detroit. And then also there's a whole new population of people who are moving down there, and I assume they would like to know, well, what was there before? And if they scratch the surface a little bit, they're going to find out that there's a marvelous history and a lot of wonderful things happen right down there, even to some degree an unbelievable amount of interesting history that ties to so many different things. For instance, when the groundbreaking was being held for the building on the Hudson site, I was asked to help produce a video that would be played at the groundbreaking, and they ultimately never really used it, but it was a young lady that filmed me, just like we're sitting here and talking. And after I spoke about Hudson's fairly briefly, she said, you know what, she said, everything you're talking about, I have no idea what it was. She said, I shop in Walmart or I shop online at Amazon. I might go to a specialty store, but the idea of a department store that carried all these different things and that was on 14 floors and more, she said, I can't even imagine what that would be like. So on my way home that day from that filming, I thought, somebody's got to really cogently put this down in a format so that people can know and understand, and that maybe 30 years from now, somebody picks up this book in a library or at a used bookstore, they're going to read a fascinating story.
Excellent. This is a great segue from where I want to go. And for me, the connection is that my mom, I'm a little bit too young where I missed, for whatever, my mom is passionate about it, myself, but I didn't get to go down there, but I heard so much about it. It was still around when I was alive, but it wasn't a thing for me. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so, kind of missed the wheelhouse of that time. But my mom and dad would talk very passionately about how nice it was. Even though they were separated, it was a go-to destination. But so I want to start jumping in now. We talked about a little bit about some interactions with other people and how the book kind of is so important to you. Let's jump right into the book. And at the beginning, I was so fascinated because it's a history of Detroit, not just of Hudson's. It's an amazing history lesson for people. And so when I was reading that first few chapters really, in there something really caught me about in its heyday when Hudson's was there. Detroit was kind of like the Paris of the U.S. in some ways. That quote came up a couple of times. Mm-hmm. And Hudson's was part of the center of it all. So can you talk about how in the early parts of this book, you give us kind of a little history lesson about Detroit, about Hudson's, and that really got me passionately into it. And I'm imagining the bustling, hustling town that it was, mm-hmm. and Hudson's being the center of a lot of that
like a beehive
action.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, you can't separate, if you want to tell the history of an organization, and especially one that was as central literally and figuratively to the city of Detroit, you have to understand the setting. Things don't just happen somewhere for no reason. It happens for a reason. So I even need to refresh my own knowledge of the history of Detroit to figure out why did it develop this way, and why did Hudson's be where it was. Now, one interesting thing is that a lot of downtowns in Detroit cities would have several large department stores, but they usually have one on one end of the street and one on the other, and maybe one or two in between. And that's almost like the traditional mall layout that we have that was successful for many years. So they learned something from that even, but Detroit was different. Everything was clustered in one little spot. And then there were stores all around. And that all came about because after Cadillac set foot on the banks of the Detroit River, or the Straits as they were called, they founded a city. And that city grew and went through the American Revolution and through, it started as a French town and went through other things. But in 1805, it all burned down. So there was an opportunity there to construct a new city, really. And luckily, there was no one killed in that fire, not like in Chicago, where their 1871 fire was catastrophic. This one was catastrophic, but we had some personalities in the city at that time that were forward-looking. And right after the fire, there was a Judge Woodward from Washington, D.C. that was appointed to come and oversee the rebuilding of Detroit in a way. And he designed a plan that was modular in style, but its feature was 60 and 30 degree angles and wide boulevards that continued out from the whole center of town, and that this city could then grow modularly with adding more triangles and more along those 60 and 30 degree lines. So it was like a blueprint for the future. Unfortunately, after a while, it was too hard for surveyors and property owners to divide up their property along these angles, so they just imposed a grid right on top of it. But much of that still exists. We have Grand Circus Park downtown, mm-hmm. and we have those spokes that were part of the original design were Gratiot Avenue, Woodward, Washington Boulevard, which was famous in its day, Michigan Avenue, and so forth. The name that Judge Woodward, the street, Woodward Avenue, was named after him, but being somewhat more modest, he denied that it was named after him. He said, no, it just goes toward the woods. Oh, that's all I'll admit. The road really isn't named after me. It's a little anecdote, but really, for many years, Detroit was considered the Paris of North America because of these boulevards, because of what remained, and the city built up around them. So each street took on its own spatial character. Washington Boulevard had aisles in the middle. Woodward Avenue was just a straight thoroughfare, but it was lined with tall buildings. And this plan had some resemblance to Paris with its great boulevards and monumental buildings along the boulevards and all that. So there was some real justification for that. However, if you really delve into the history, that plan was created in 1805. And Baron Haussmann, who worked for the Emperor Napoleon III in the 19th century in Paris to create those boulevards, this didn't happen until the late 1850s up to the 1870, and then it was continued after that, after the Paris Commune. But there's justification that you could say, no, Detroit's not the Paris of North America. Paris is the Detroit of Europe, actually. So, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek. Nobody would probably have a lot of Frenchmen chasing me down the,
Right.
down the corridor here if I said that was a serious consideration. But there's something to it, because we had that idea really first. And some of it was really based off of, I think, Woodward's thinking. He came from Washington, so there was the famous L'Enfant plan for Washington, D.C. So we benefited from all these things in Detroit. And so we have a much more centralized downtown than other cities. It centers around the intersection of Woodward, Michigan Avenue, Gratiot, and those things. So that's where Hudson wound up being located.
Excellent. Now, this is a very significant book, over 500 pages. There's a lot to cover, and I don't want to give everything. We want people to buy the book. But I enjoyed everything that I really got into. We get farther along in the book. We get into the heyday, what I maybe consider, and you might say otherwise, the heyday really seems like maybe in the 50s and the 60s. People
Exactly.
are very passionate about that
Yeah,
era. And let's talk about why so many people consider it not only the heyday for Detroit, but certainly the heyday for Hudson's.
Well, I think there, obviously Hudson's existed in Detroit from 1881, which is a little late as far as department store history goes. Lord and Taylor was founded, I believe, in 1826. So, and it's the story of J.L. Hudson that makes it that way. However, you know, but it was prosperous. Every era had something good for Hudson's in it. So J.L. Hudson himself founded the store, located it onto Farmer Street in Detroit, and then poked through to Woodward during his life. And his 4 nephews, because he didn't have kids, he trained his sister's kids to run the store for him. And they really made it the great thing it was. So in 1928, that big monumental building was, for all purposes, finished. There was one little corner that was added after World War II. But we had this sense of prosperity, of looking forward, of really doing great things after we had essentially won that war. Sacrifice, hardship, bloodshed, but looking forward then after that instead of a negativity. That's when Hudson's really took off. After the war, they started initiating many more community-type events, such as the Michigan on Canvas program, where they hired artists to go throughout the state of Michigan and depict it in works of art. And that was a very famous thing that they did, and is even to this day, there are some people interested in trying to find where all these paintings are and put it together as a collection again for showing to the people of Michigan, to show just how beautiful their state is based on the eyes of a variety of different artists. And as that moved into the 60s, it was even more so. In the 50s and 60s, we also had shopping center development. And Hudson's never believed that by developing these big shopping centers around town, they were going to take away the central focus and importance of their downtown store. And they had projections that said, yeah, each shopping center might wind up doing 25%, but 50% would be downtown. But as they built more and more of them, obviously, and people moved away, the downtown store sort of lost its significance. There's a lot of effort in the 70s to keep the store viable, but by the 80s, that wasn't the case anymore. So that you're very right about that heyday period. In the early beginnings of the 1960s, under the leadership of Joseph L. Hudson Jr., they developed their own graphic program so that their advertising was very artistic and very beautiful. It matched with the advertising bags, clothing labels, and things like that. It was all part of one of the first times really a store got together and decided upon an image. And everybody will remember the olive green bags with the polka dots on them and all that. So I tried to translate some of that into the book. And actually, I got a very good compliment from my copy editor, her mother worked for Hudson's, and she has her own stories and interesting things I've been able to incorporate into the text. But many people have actually told me after this that opening that book up and reading it, it's like being back there again, because you have the colors, the bag, the advertising, everything makes you feel like you're back in that era of the heyday of Hudson's, and you can still see in your mind's eye what it was like when you went down there. So I think the book performs a service for people in order to allow them to enjoy those memories.
Absolutely. I was mesmerized going through it, and that's going to lead me into my next kind of question and a statement. I was blown away at the amount of historical photos, lavish illustrations, ads that were in different things. Absolutely incredible. talk about the amount of time, because I started thinking about writing is certainly one aspect, but the amount of time to capture these types of images that different people had. Tell me a little bit about that process, because this is a little different than your typical book writing. Like, I'm really interested in how you were able to track down some of these incredible photos ranging from the early 1900s till the closing of Hudson's, and ads and different types of stuff you found. Can you talk a little bit about that and what made it into the book and why?
So at the basis of that answer are a couple things. I wanted to create a book that didn't just tell the history. Wasn't just a bunch of dry text. And this date, this happened, and they built a building and it was so many stories and it was so many square feet. And I wanted to create something where it would show people the history. So you can read the 250,000 words that are in there, plus, or you can pull it off a shelf one day and just browse it for a while, and I think you'll have a pleasant experience. And you'll know more by seeing things than just a writer trying to, I can describe things in the floweriest language, but I think sometimes unless you see it, it's not really gonna take hold the way it would. So that was my goal all along, was to produce this book that showed you rather than told you. Beyond that, I have an interest in department stores. From the time I was young, my mother loved to shop. And
how were you able, though, to track down so much of this material?
You know, that's the whole research part of it. And I love doing research. It's fascinating to discover things in a library. And here, the Detroit Historical Society has a great collection of photos. Hudson's had its own a photographer that they worked with. His name was Davis Hilmer. And parts of his photographic collection are preserved there. So I was very lucky to have the cooperation of the Detroit Historical Society. I have a good friend, Mike Hauser, who collects tons of memorabilia, so I was able to tap into every issue of the Hudsonian magazine that Hudson put out for its employees. And I even went as far away as I possibly could. I was in libraries in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids, and newspapers are a fabulous resource. And when you would see some of these illustrations, that they would have a big import fair, international import fair, and there's photographs of it, but I really loved when their store artists would draw something like the fact that they built a replica of the Tower Bridge in London and the Ponte Vecchio in Florence over the first floor counters where they had high ceilings, and they built these giant replicas of European bridges to emphasize that that's where all this import merchandise was coming from.
Right.
So it was with great pleasure that I found those things and then sought the permission to use them. And really the newspaper was a treasure trove. Those ads, some of them are extremely attractive.
Yes.
And they themselves bring back memories of things. When they were talking, brought back for one of the people that I interviewed that a couple of years ago, somebody wrote me, and knowing that my interest in department stores, said, is it possible that I petted a baby elephant at Hudson's? He said, I've got this memory and I don't know if my mind is tricking me. So I went to the newspaper archives and I looked it up, and I found that, of course, there was a petting zoo for Easter time, and they had baby animals.
Wow.
And you could go in and see these baby animals. And then I found, here and there you find a picture, like in those archives, and there's these wide-eyed children in Hudson's, and they had exhibits about animals inside what they call giant magic eggs. So each exhibit had a circular enclosure that looked like it was cracked around the outside, and you could go and see a deer that was tied to the Bambi story, which was really popular at the time. Mm-hmm. So these little discoveries like that, I want to write about that. I got to put that in there. Even probably younger people today don't even know that there was a car named Hudson.
Right.
And it was eventually became part of American Motors. And a friend of ours posted pictures on the anniversary of her dad's death, and I saw the car there, and she said, that's my dad with his beloved Hudson. And I went, wow, he had one of those, because they were considered really hot cars at one time. And that company was funded by Joseph L. Hudson. He never really had anything to do with the active management of it, but he, as a businessman, trusted people and was able to figure out who was it that had the smarts and could do things, and then he'd support them with funds. So they named the company after him to reflect that fact. It was never part of the J.L. Hudson company. It was a separate company, but it
Right,
did
but
have
they did
that. And then some of the people that he bankrolled were also married into his family. So he had also a reason to try to help his own family when they had an idea that they could build a better car and do it for less money and something economical that was really hot and powerful and fun to drive.
Interesting.
So-
Now, Bruce, your passion for Hudson's is apparent in every page of this book, and I was hoping that maybe you would share that passion was sparked at some point when you were younger. Do you have any type of story you want to share with people about a reason that you can first remember being in love with Hudson's and why it was such a special place to you?
For me personally, I want to guess that this probably goes back to 1962, maybe. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but Christmas came around, and my parents obviously would ask what I wanted for Christmas, and I said I wanted a roller coaster. And my dad was really good at, we'd take the Tinker Toys and we'd build something, but you really couldn't build a roller coaster out of the Tinker Toys as much as I would have liked to, and it certainly wouldn't operate. So, and I always seemed to want something that was outrageously difficult, something different than the other kids had with G.I. Joes and whatever, and that wasn't going to work for me. So I wanted this roller coaster. So even though my mother, my parents were not on the high end of the income scale, my dad worked in a factory, and my mother was home with us until later in life, and she would go and shop basically in the bargain basement. That's what I remember from her. And she would, when my neighborhood kids would get their back to school clothes from Hudson's, and I looked forward to my brother's hand-me-downs, she'd say, yeah, that's a store for rich people. It's really, well, but she'd break down and go in the basement and buy something, a new shirt to wear to school or something like that. But this roller coaster thing stumped them. So she and my dad decided they were going to take me down. Hudson's had the biggest Toyland, like it had the biggest bookstore. If you wanted books, you went to Hudson's. If you wanted toys, and it was something you couldn't find anywhere else, because they said if you can't find it at Hudson's, it probably doesn't exist. So I remember very well them taking me down there. I think I probably saw Santa Claus, because I can remember just all this stuff on the 12th floor that was going on. There was a merry-go-round, and there was music and the smell of candied apples and popcorn and all kind of things going on there. And they took me into the toy department, which at the time was really laid out in counters, and there were salespeople behind the counters. And I can remember my mom walking up to a woman behind a counter and saying, "Can you help me? I got a dilemma here that my son would like a roller coaster, and I can't find one anywhere." And the lady said, "Well, in fact, we have two." And she showed us and demonstrated to us. One was plastic with like a little wind-up thing, and the little car would go around it. And the other one was metal, and it actually had an elastic band that took the little car on wheels, and it would make a snaking track down to the end and go again. And the plastic one I thought was cheap looking. So my parents said, "Which one of these do you think would make a good Christmas present from Santa Claus for you?" And I liked the metal one. And lo and behold, that Christmas it was wrapped up.
Santa brought it to you
Yeah.
that Christmas.
And I don't know how maybe my mom took me to see Santa, and my dad bought it and took it to the car or something like that to preserve some amount of surprise to it. But I was tremendously young at that point. And it was so fascinating to see all the stuff on those counters, and I truly figured that I was really lucky to have the parents that I had, and they would go out of their way. Even as a kid, I can remember that feeling. So I didn't really worry about, but wait, look over there, I want that train, and I want this, and I want that. That didn't really happen, because I was so satisfied with the fact that what I really, really wanted and what I was able to state to them was going to come true. And Hudson's was such a part of that, right? They couldn't find it anywhere else. And one of their buyers understood what kids liked and didn't like, and would make sure the store had all that stuff. And it was fascinating. It's something that they could not do when they had smaller branch stores around town, because that store was over, almost 2.5 million square feet of space in it. So they could offer a huge
Sure, that's unbelievable.
depth
today's
and
standard.
breadth of merchandise that I don't know if even Amazon can do that.
Right.
So it was really fascinating at the time. And to a kid, it was like a wonderland, of course.
Well, excellent, Bruce. As we're starting to run a little short on time, I want you to look into your camera there and let people know how they can learn more about you, so your website, and more importantly, how can they order the book?
Very good. Well, my website, I formed my own publishing company to publish my own works. The company is called Editions BK, and if you go to Editions, as in 3rd edition, 4th edition, Editions BK, which are my initials, editionsbk.com is my website. For some reasons, my book, like you say, involved a lot of work, involved a lot of photographs, some of which I pay a royalty for. It's not a mass market book that is going to go on Amazon. I'd rather support local retailers, and I'd also like to really preserve the exclusivity of the book as it is. Mm-hmm. If I had to put it on Amazon, I'd have to double the cost right off the bat. So to preserve a reasonable price for it, it's sold out in its first 9 days, and it's taken me a while to get another shipment in. I'm expecting that shipment before April 1st. Within the next 2 weeks, I'm going to reopen ordering online at my website, and I'll have a special price for the book on my website. The book will also be available at Pure Detroit. It will be available at the, there's a bookstore in Oak Park, I believe it's the Book Nook, or not quite sure, I can't remember off that, but those are two local places that will definitely have it. I'm going to put on the website, I have lecture engagements that are coming up, book signings, a number of events, and I'll keep people updated with that once the books come in. So you could buy one from me, or you could buy one from any one of those outlets.
Well, Bruce, this has been a real pleasure. Reading your book was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
People are going to learn when they visit your website that you're an author of previous books, and you're going to be working on books in the future. So we're definitely going to see you here again. And we're going to talk about your previous books. We're going to have you come on to talk about your future books. But I thank you so much for coming on today.
It was an honor.
Folks, I can't say enough about Hudson's, Detroit's world-famous department store. If you are a fan of Hudson's, if you're a fan of Detroit and Michigan and some of its history, this is the book for you. It's a fantastic read. It's great as just a coffee table book, as Bruce mentioned, that you can sip through from time to time while you're sipping a coffee and just look at the beautiful pictures and the history that was Hudson's of Detroit. So I really recommend you pick it up. I thank you so much for watching Good Reads, and we'll see you next time.